it's just. Not sure. Okay, bad. I can come up here and do this.
What's that?
You want me to come up here? I can come up here and do it.
Yeah.
I mean, whatever. Whatever it is. Right. If it makes you feel like, you know.
Huh? No.
Good, yourself. Yeah, thank you for the invite. Okay, thank you. You think you'll get everybody in?
Oh, yeah, my pleasure. Wouldn't miss it. I know when you said you wanted to go after those, you really didn't think it fixed the problem. Well,
Yeah.
the neat thing is about it, when I get done, I'll be able to go watch Letterman.
You may miss them.
I don't want to miss him, Jeff. So let's get moving.
I'll get later in the morning when I try to get out of bed.
Yeah, because I'm sitting with my knees crossed. I didn't know.
I cross my legs and cuss. I really should do that. Wait, put your feet on the floor.
Hey, if I can invite the witnesses to come forward for the next panel, we will begin momentarily.
The hate is I can't read. I can read, but I'm like this, so I have to go on.
Welcome. We'll proceed with the next panel. We're delighted today to have Michael Snovich representing the Alliance for Rail Competition, Mr. John Ficker representing the National Industrial Transportation League, and Mr. Thomas F. Jensen representing the UPS company. We'll start with Mr. Snovich. Please proceed.
I'm going to say good afternoon, but I'm going to say good evening, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vice Chairman, and Commissioner. I thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I am Mike Snovich, Executive Director of the Alliance for Rail Competition, and I am here today on behalf of ARC, as well as 16 groups of shippers of agricultural commodities, and on behalf of the Honorable Brian Schweitzer, Governor of Montana. The captive shippers' interests I represent support efforts by the railroad industry to improve service and meet future demands for rail transportation service. Very few people oppose these goals, and we are pleased to see the issue of the nation's transportation infrastructure attracting more attention in Washington. At the same time, we are seeing troubling signs that policymakers are turning away from the idea of public funding for many forms of other needed infrastructure, and this was stated in our written comments. The Railroad Competition Act of 2005, which ARC supported, provided for some $35 billion in loans and loan guarantees for railroad infrastructure investment. ARC is prepared to support investment tax credit legislation for the railroads, so long as it is designed to promote real infrastructure expansion for widespread shipper benefits. The ITC should be good for, and this is important, all of America, not just select the lanes of rail traffic that just gives additional financial benefit to the railroads. We are concerned that rail infrastructure investment will become a new code words for more and higher rates increases for captive shippers, which we represent. This would be bad law and bad public policy for many reasons. First, captive shippers have already made disproportionate contributions to the growth and financial strength of the railroads under the ICC and STB policies that essentially let market-dominant railroads charge whatever they like, force shippers to absorb operating costs, and force shippers to accept second-rate service. Projections of higher freight volumes do not justify more of the same. Second, many captive shippers are also anticipating higher prices for other forms of infrastructure investment. For example, many grain shippers, which we represent, are facing higher trucking costs as railroads shift to the smaller number of large elevators able to load 100 car trains. And we discussed this at a prior hearing. Third, it is not yet clear what infrastructure investments will offer the greatest public benefits and what investments the railroads intend to favor. For example, why should grain shippers pay higher rates on grain shipments to Pacific Northwest and Gulf Coast ports if all the increased revenues will be used for international container shipments from the port of Los Angeles, Long Beach, to big box stores in the nation's largest cities? God bless you. If major railroads continue to modify their systems so the larger volumes are forced to move from between fewer origins and destinations, maybe the bulk of infrastructure investments will be needed for short lines, not class ones. Fourth, major railroads are at least or at near revenue adequacy. Therefore, they no longer need differential pricing, and it should be able to fund needed infrastructure investments through higher rates and charges on non-captive traffic and by raising capital, like other competitive industries, in the financial markets. The board has the tools it needs to strike the right balance between the needs of railroads, the needs of captive shippers, and public interest. Under the common carrier obligation, railroads shall provide transportation and service on reasonable request by shipper, and under a fundamental principle of rate reasonableness as stated by the board just a few months ago, a captive shipper should not be required to pay more than is necessary for the carrier involved to earn adequate revenues, nor should it pay more than is necessary for efficient service, and a captive shipper should not bear the cost of any facilities from which it derives no benefit. We urge the board to stand by these principles, along with the basic principles of fairness as we transition from a rail industry with excess capacity to an environment in which railroads and rail shippers seem to be facing constrained capacity. For more than 25 years, the ICC and STB has given high priority to promoting railroad revenue adequacy, which it should because of the state of the railroads at that point. Today, the railroads no longer need the board's help in achieving that goal. However, the need for captive shippers for protection from abuse of the railroad market power has never been higher, and will only increase if the railroads seek to fund infrastructure investments through higher rates on captive traffic. In summary, we're saying we expect the American economy to grow. We hope the American economy will grow. With that, the railroads are going to be required to add additional investment. How they make money for that investment, we're willing to support. For example, investment tax credits, providing it's given wide benefit to America, not just the railroads. And we don't want it to be on the backs of just captive shippers. Thank you, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Snovich. We'll now proceed with Mr. John Fichter.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vice Chairman, Commissioner Mulvey. It's a great pleasure to be in front of you again. It's always a pleasure to be in front of the STB, and I'm excited to say that this is my first visit to your new facility, and it certainly is a beautiful facility, and you've done a great job in the transition. I had the privilege of being the last testifier at the former STB headquarters, so I'm here at the first hearing this time. The League's really pleased to be a part of this proceeding today, and the issue of transportation capacity is critical across the spectrum of modes, not just rail. And I think it's important, while this hearing is emphasizing rail capacity, that we have to look at the whole transportation system in this country and recognize that our highway system, our barge and lock and dam barge system, and all of these are genuinely constrained. And it's appropriate that we get into this today. I'd like to note that the League has been engaged in this effort to improve transportation capacity in the rail sector for the last 2 years with the American Association of Railroads and their rail members in developing and working through non-capital methods of improving rail capacity. We've had 2 sub-teams working together on one called the First Mile, Last Mile, where shippers and carriers are working on process improvements in the world of switching, which to the carload shipper is an important part. I have to compliment BNSF, Matt Rose, and his team for the work they've put in on this effort. We've also had capacity and asset utilization teams that have been working on interline service, empty private fleet transit time, and rail traffic forecasts, the latter of which has been attempting to broaden and standardize the use of customer traffic forecasts to better enable carriers to plan for infrastructure improvements. And this was important, I think, this morning in the testimony of Secretary Shane and the questions that you, Chairman Nottingham, asked of him about that. There can be no doubt that rail traffic has grown recently. The key driver in this growth has been intermodal, or international trade. In 1990, less than 14% of our economy depended on international trade. By 2000, that was 24%, and it appears that by 2010, it'll be close to 30%. And most of this traffic arrived in the form of containers. It's been discussed many times today in the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. In 2006, rail intermodal traffic was up over 5% over the previous year compared to 1.6% in all traffic. The growth of this traffic has had a profound effect on the rail system, and it tends to take up capacity in lieu of other trains such as merchandise traffic and unit coal trains, and it takes up significant space on the railroad. And the expected growth in the future has been pointed out by everyone today. There's been multiple studies done, AASHTO, and that's been referred to not only by their testimony but by everybody else who knows how to spell it. The American Trucking Association has also done a fairly significant study expecting 32% increase in freight volumes by 2016, with rail freight tonnage expected to grow by 30%, and DOT has also done a study estimating that 55% growth by 2020. Now, you can lump all these together and say whatever you want, but at the end of the day, there's going to be more product moving in our country to feed the consumer demand that we all expect. And even if these projections are half wrong, we've got a serious problem on how we're going to move the goods in this country. And it's very clear, as you look at this, that rail system capacity is increasingly constrained. And you can see this virtually everywhere. AAR numbers show that traffic density on the nation's rail system has significantly increased, the highest point in the last 25 years. The signs of rail capacity constraints are widespread. According to the AAR, train speed has declined since the early 1990s, and we've heard several comments on that today. Moreover, such system speed contributes to capacity problems. And during the height of the Union Pacific's problems in 2005, they put out a slide, and Jim Young referred to it this morning. I'll just hold it up for your edification. 1 mile an hour in velocity improvement equals 250 locomotives, 5,000 freight cars, and 180 train and engine employees. That's a significant thing. I asked him if they got the 20-mile-an-hour improvement, would that number still work? And I think Commissioner Mulvey would probably help me with the economics and the math on that one. But the reality of it is that this problem is not just a problem of not enough iron and steel. It's a problem about how the operations work. And this has been borne out by our members and by recent program that the League held in Washington, at which Chairman Nottingham spoke, our spring policy forum, where Ed Wolf of Bear Stearns presented a paper estimating that rail prices have increased by 35% to their customers since 2002. Now, informally, this has been verified by League members over and over again that they have seen 30 to 40% increases in rail costs. Now, the rail industry is strong. There's no doubt about that. For the first time since the Second World War, the industry as a whole is close to or at earning its cost of capital. And I think that's a question that gets raised continually, whether the cost of capital that the board approves or the cost of capital that Wall Street thinks about. In the presentation that Mr. Wolf made, he noted that 4 of the 6 Class 1 carriers, BNSF, CN, CP, and Norfolk Southern, earned their cost of capital in 2006, with the industry's return on capital at 9.8%. Now, nothing points out more the financial strength of the rail industry than what happened last weekend, when one of America's most respected investors, Warren Buffett, took a 10.9% stake in Burlington Northern Santa Fe. Something tells me that the investment community thinks the railroads are doing pretty well, and it's not a bad place to put your money. He also indicated in the press release that they've taken a position on other railroads, although they didn't indicate the amount of the stake that they had taken. Railroads are spending record amounts in capital. In 2006, it's estimated they're close to $10 billion. However, a significant portion of that money is required for maintenance of existing systems, not for capital expansion. AASHTO's studies estimate that an additional $2.6 to $4 billion are needed annually to upgrade the systems. what do we need to do? What actions need to be taken to increase capacity? This is not just about money. It's about multiple things. It's about improving technology. It's about improving processes and operations. It's about improving productivity, and it's about ways to deal with investments. Earlier today, we heard about positive train control. From what I'm told from a number of people, and I'm not an engineer, positive train control could add 10 to 15% capacity in the existing rail system without another inch of track. Secondly, we've got to have operational changes, and we've seen some of that. The Canadian National has shown the benefits of running a scheduled railroad. Some of the work that's being done by our first mile, last mile team will improve the processes and operations. Both the technology and operational changes are subsumed under the broader heading of productivity, getting more out of the existing system. Finally, there is clearly a need to have additional investment in on-the-ground infrastructure, rails, ties, ballast, the whole thing. While the current and expected future financial condition of the rail carriers clearly enables them to make larger infrastructure investments than they have in the past, additional investment over and above that capacity expansion presently contemplated by the industry will be needed to meet future demands. I would direct your attention to the submission by the Auto Alliance, which was submitted to you, and they're not testifying today, that there is a strong need for a national rail infrastructure plan. And this has been alluded to several times today, and I'll talk about this more in a little bit further. So what can the board do? What's the board's role in all of this? The board is not a policy setter. It doesn't pass legislation. It's an agency that's responsible for the rail industry in this country. Let me suggest that there are several areas. We have to have information about capacity and more customer input. We need better information first. And I think this was a question that Chairman Nottingham, you directed to Jeff Shane this morning in your comments. The League believes that the board has a responsibility to provide policymakers, that is Congress, with a viable, objective standards for the industry and an information for them to make sound policy decisions. There are several areas where this could be improved. First, there is a need for a clearer, common definition and an objective measure of capacity. Among many of the industry in this country, you will ask their trade associations, what percentage of the industry is you running at capacity? The oil industry is running at 72%. The steel industry is at 84%. The auto industry is at 67%. Whatever the numbers are, there is a number out there. We have no metric in the rail industry of how to achieve where they're at today so that we could all agree and we could all work together to deal with a capacity problem. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be simple. And there will be plenty of people who object to moving in that direction. But it will allow us to do this, and we believe the board should initiate a proceeding to help define accurate definitions and measurements of capacity. Second, the board should develop information as to the effects of capacity constraints. At the present time, data available on effective capacity constraints are general: train speed, terminal dwell, cars on line. The League suggests that additional data would be helpful, such as system velocity in key lanes. Our members don't really care about the averages. They care about what's going on in key lanes in this country, with breakdowns by commodity. Third, the board should require a better report on capital expenditure for maintenance versus capital expenditures for capacity expansion. Bear Stearns noted that it is often difficult to obtain data on this important matter from the carrier's public reports. Policymakers should have accurate information as to the amount of capital investment going into the capacity expansion as distinct from capital investments devoted to maintaining existing systems. Fourth, the League believes that the board has been established by Congress as the agency whose focus is on the rail industry, and therefore the board has a responsibility to keep Congress informed about the needs of the industry. The League believes that the board should consider issuing a state of the industry report on an annual basis, including reports from rail carriers and their customers, to assist policymakers in prescribing sound national policies. This was pretty well mentioned this morning by Secretary Shane and also in the AASHTO comments. Secondly, there's need for customer involvement in infrastructure improvements. While the final decision on how to spend the money and the investment dollars will be made by rail carrier management, the League believes that carriers will be well served to get input from their customers as to the workings of the network and where investment is needed. The League believes the STB can play an important role in this process. Specifically, the League suggests that the STB direct each rail Class 1 carrier to create what we'll call a Rail Capacity and Infrastructure Advisory Committee, composed of representatives of a broad cross-section of carrier customers and short line connections, to provide a forum where carriers could obtain input from its customers as to the infrastructure needs, where the rail carrier can brief its customers on its plans for the future. Such a committee arrangement could establish a structured system to provide information and input between customers and carriers as to network capacity and infrastructure needs. And the full range of customer needs must be considered, including coal, grain, intermodal, and carload. The board could require the rail carriers to also file a system diagram with infrastructure being eliminated, which you currently do. Every railroad every year has to file a plan on what they're going to abandon. Why not file a plan on what you're going to add? Wouldn't that be intriguing, so that the general public could understand what's going to be added, as well as what's going to be taken away? We believe these are some actions that your organization, this agency, can take to improve the rail system and deal with the capacity constraints that we all have talked about today. Finally, we'd like to thank you for your time this morning, and I think the question that the board needs to continually focus on, and the rail industry continues to focus on, is that the rail industry must invest in a 40-year investment cycle, yet the pressures on them from Wall Street are quarter to quarter, and I have yet to figure out how to reconcile that conflict. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome, Mr. Jensen. Mr. Jensen, I recognize your company has a few truckers, so if you go over your hours of service and need to rest for a little while, we can work with you. Please proceed.
Another issue for another day, Commissioner Nottingham. I'm going to, if it's okay with the commissioners, I'm going to bypass some of the formalities and pleasantries here and get right into it. And I also want to, believe it or not, recognize your able staff sitting here. It's been a long day, but very interesting day. And I notice your staff's been here all day, attentive. And we know how much work they do behind the scenes, and also this poor court reporter working overtime, double time, or whatever. I hope you're being properly enumerated for your services. So let me do this. I'm also going to skip reading a statement. We submitted a statement for the record, of course. I'd like to paraphrase and mention a couple things I think of interest to the board in the context of everything we've been speaking about this afternoon and today. Number one, a little bit of background, and I'm going to spare you the infomercial, but I want to give you a little bit of the context of why UPS cares. Number two, we'll talk about some of the current status of the issues that we've been discussing all day, and lastly, our view of the world on some of the solutions. So I think the commissioners are fairly, I hate to say you know us to a certain capacity, but to a certain extent you're familiar with UPS and what we do. We're now in our 100th year of service, we're proud to say. And what started as a couple brothers running a messenger service in Seattle has grown to a multimodal, highly integrated and intermodal, interdependent transportation network, a global network that services, provides service to 200 countries and territories around the world, and we pick up and deliver 15.6 million packages a day. And a key component of that, here's my point, is what we do in the United States on the rail. Because we've got two areas of growth right now at UPS. Number one, our international portion of the business. And number two, the non-small package, which is what we grew up with, what we started as, but rather the supply chain and logistics. And both of those areas are increasingly relying upon our rail service here. So we're a large rail customer. We've testified before the commission. UPS has been moving small packages and now commodities to an extent on flat rail cars and rail cars for 30 years. And a day like today, we'll have 3,100 rail containers and rail cars full of packages moving around the country. 3,100 on an average day, which is about 3.4 million packages in our system moving on the rail. And we want to do more, not less, more, if the service is there, because these packages, in large measure today, are time sensitive. But again, unlike some of our competitors that operate intermodal integrated systems, we want to do more on the rail, not less. Are we captive? No. Are we constructively captive? Yes. We don't want to put more back on the highways. There's all kinds of problems. The good news is, since we're such an intermodal operator, if this hearing was on highway congestion, we'd be here. If this hearing was on aviation issues, we'd be here. That's the good news. That's also what? The bad news, given the freight forecast. If the freight forecast at AASHTO, that DOT, that some of the academics have talked about today and have been mentioned on this board just a few moments ago, if they're half correct, we're in a world of hurt to move the freight. And it's not our freight, it's the freight and the packages and the widgets of our customers. Every single thing we move, somebody shipped it, and there's a consignee on the other end. So that's why we care. The freight forecasts are ugly. There's no room for modal warfare, trains versus trucks fighting. That's not our bag. There is enough of the transportation and freight pie in the future to go around. We feel very strongly about that. We're going to testify as an aside next week at the DOT National Commission hearing in Chicago. That Matt Rose is the commissioner. I know the DOT has been intimately involved, the secretary, of course, and Maria Sino and others on our view of the world on these very matters. So that's kind of the historical background in UPS. Our rail spend, one last item, for 2006 was about $1.5 billion. That's direct rail spend from UPS in addition to what we control through our supply chain group. So if we're not the single largest customer of every Class 1 CEO that was in the room this morning, we're among the handful if we're not the number one. And we talk to them all the time. And we want them to succeed. Let me say it again. We want them to succeed. If they succeed, we succeed. That's the background the context I want to set for you this afternoon. Current issues, service. Well, we've got challenges, and the challenges remain. Time in transit is up for us, i.e. we're moving slower. Velocity is down. Commissioner Mulvey mentioned earlier this morning on velocity, and John alluded to it as well. We're not moving our trains or intermodal movements at the same speed we were, or at best, just it's a push from where we were 15 years ago. I ask you to think about other modes of transportation. What's going slower than it did 15 years ago? I ask you to consider that. It's an an ongoing source of frustration. Trust me, we talk with our railroad service partners, and we truly consider them partners all the time about service. The picture in the West is considerably worse than it is in the East. I don't want to name names, and we've got significant challenges in the West in moving our rail movements. In the East, we're doing a little bit better. And it's not fair to stand up here, sit here and throw, and just be critical. I tell you, a couple of railroads have done a fine job for us. Norfolk Southern deserves credit for what they did in 2006 for UPS. During our hour of need, our peak season, which is basically our holiday season, shipping season, they went 83 days in a row without a service failure. That's outstanding service, and they showed they could do it. A smaller railroad, Florida East Coast Railway, tremendous service last year, and they deserve the credit, not just to be trashed by rail shippers, that they provided service that we pay for. So we know some of the rails can do it. We know there's challenges. We know they're working on it, but still, fluidity, reliability, consistency, recoverability, that's our problem. We're not saying capacity, overused term, but that's the very reason we're here today. Capacity, the answer is that the rails should get bigger through capacity. We want them to get better through consistency and reliability. Get better. Positive train control is another great example. It was referred to a moment ago by Mr. Ficker. Commissioner Mulvaney mentioned it. The STB, the NTSB has had it on their most wanted list since 1990. But I think it's fair to say the railroads have been slow to adopt the positive train control system technology. There was alluded to earlier this morning by several of the CEOs what they've done on technology, and we work very closely with them again. But that's an area where we really think they can do better. So again, fluidity, reliability, recoverability, those are the things we're interested in doing. When we last spoke here in the old venue, it was October of 2005. Vice Chairman Buttry and Commissioner Mulvey were in attendance and proceeded over the hearing on this 25-year anniversary of the Staggers Act. I spoke on behalf of UPS. Since that time, our service picture has gotten a little bit better. I want to be fair. However, we're in such a competitive environment. 1 year ago, 13 months ago, March of 06, we took 500,000 packages a day and took them off the rails and put them on the road. That's 600 commercial vehicles. You know, Chairman Nottingham, from your time on working on the highway side, and so do you, Commissioner Mulvey. We don't want to put more commercial vehicles on the road. We don't think America wants more commercial vehicles on the road. We want to do more on the highway side. So why do we move 600 commercial vehicles or that amount of package volume from the rails to the roads? Well, and it's key lanes. It's key lanes like Atlanta to Baltimore, from Washington to Denver, those kind of lanes across the country. We need to be competitive with our competitors and remain competitive with them, many of whom are on the road all the time, who aren't making intermodal movements. And if the service isn't there, as good as we feel about the rails and trying to make these gains and all the things from a CapEx standpoint they're doing, if the service isn't there, we have to react. So we say no to more mergers if there were mergers in the future. We don't believe it's in the public interest. We say the jury, from our perspective, is out on an investment tax credit. That's logical. Conceptually might make sense. It's not the answer. We need more. We know the railroads are in a very delicate position with capital expenditures, and the numbers they present today are compelling. And we know that they need to reward their share owners and run a good railroad, financially fiscal. However, it is not enough, and we need to do more. We've raised the issue, and it has fallen like the proverbial lead balloon of a railroad trust fund. It has fallen on deaf ears by folks in the rail community. There's an aviation trust fund, warts and all. There's a highway trust fund, which has got some issues. There's an inland waterway trust fund. Those are user-based trust funds, correct? money's bled off in some instances, but they're user-based trust funds. If there was a rail trust fund, and, how do we structure that? Well, some of that remains to be determined, that focused the funds on key bottlenecks or segments of the national network that would increase fluidity and improve reliability of the network, we certainly would support that. And we would pay more. We're not necessarily in favor of some of the re-regulatory issues that have been raised up the road. But again, it's capacity from the standpoint of making the rails better through consistency and reliability. So, in summary, we really want the freight railroads in this country to succeed. We need them to succeed. Again, we have options, but the options aren't good. Our whole, as you know, the rail system and the highway system and the whole transportation network is interdependent, and as a multimodal operator, we need each component of that to survive and to do well and to handle this significant increases of freight that we see coming down the pike. So with that said, we're here and pleased to participate as usual, and we're willing to answer any questions you may have this afternoon.
Thank you, Mr. Jensen, and each of our witnesses will proceed with questions now. Mr. Jensen, I'll start with you. We heard earlier today, and Mr. Ficker brought this up as well, at the recent news of the large stake taken out in the BNSF by Warren Buffett and the Berkshire Hathaway Company. Do you think it's generally, do you think the railroads have some, because Mr. Jensen, from some of your comments, it sounds like you believe there are some managerial or operational improvements that could be made with some innovation, with some creativity, some leadership, technology. Is it a question of just the railroads bringing in, if more Warren Buffett started showing up at more board meetings, is that, and offering up ideas, is that going to help, or what's it going to take in your view? You work for a pretty successful creative company that's overcome a lot of challenges.
Well, again, I think you hit the nail on the head, Mr. Chairman, on a number of issues that they need to focus on. We need to do more on the CapEx side. I know it's a tough balance. 30 miles in the Transcon or in the Sunset Corridor, 30 miles a year, gentlemen, to be honest with you, it's not going to do it. It's going to take an awful lot longer than that. And frankly, we've had freight slowed down and put back on the highways where promises and representations were made that we can move it on certain time commitments in that period and in that area. So we think an even greater commitment to capital expenditures is needed. The technology thing, I think the NSF shared some interesting things that they're working on today, but the notion that improving the network through efficiency through positive train control can at least several studies tell us can happen. We're somewhat at a loss why that's not happening. We're spending at UPS $1 billion a year on IT systems alone, not total CapEx, just on technology, not total CapEx, because again, we're a capital-intensive industry as well. And as a result, and there's some managerial issues as well, the train crew situation, the training. It takes a long time to ramp up in defense, I think, of the roads. I think they've been playing catch-up, and it's a big curve for them to get ahead of the curve once they got in the hole. And that's as fair as I think we can be to our rail service partners, again, who are struggling in this matters.
Let me ask Mr. Ficker, and then I'll ask Mr. Jensen as well. Many of your members, and certainly UPS, operates around the world, as we've heard. Very international membership. Do you see any? I got into this a little bit with Secretary Shane from the department, but as you do business, or your members do business around the world, do they come back and report any success stories or models about good freight rail experiences they've had elsewhere that we can learn from?
I think, let me take a stab at that, Mr. Chairman. I think, for the most part, we still, as was indicated earlier today, have the best rail system in the world. There are some things going on in Europe that I, in fact, was talking to a company with just after the evening, that Europe is making some vast improvements in that, and I think that's because the EU has decided to do more integration. And some countries in the EU, they've actually separated the operation and the infrastructure. I don't think that's going to happen in this country, and I'm not proposing it at all. But for the most part, our system of rail in this country is about as best as it can be. Where we have some productivity issues that's not related to this subject at all is the efficiency of our ports. Our ports rank below the midpoint worldwide in terms of the efficiency and the operations of those ports. When you go to Singapore, when you go to Hong Kong, when you go to Rotterdam, you see enormous productivity improvements over what we have done here. So for the most part, our rail system works fairly well. Tom, you have any?
Well, let's stick to the mode du jour here. I agree with John in that the rail system here, and we operate all over the world, as we've discussed, is vastly superior on the freight side. It truly is. And we're a little bit spoiled. However, we see issues we have on the rail side, and all surface transportation for that matter, as threatening our economic competitiveness. We truly do, because, again, it's not about taking the box of widgets from Washington, D.C. to Baltimore anymore. It's about taking it from Washington to, to Beijing. And we need land, sea, land, and land, air, land connections and movements, and we want to do more in this regard. So the system, warts and all, and being fair, really is, I think, the envy of many countries. We're trying to play catch-up in this area.
And you can watch what's going on right now in China with construction of new rail systems over there, enormously expanding. They built a highway over there in 18 months, start to finish, 30-kilometer road to the new port of Shanghai. Obviously, their environmental impact statements take a little shorter time than ours do, but the reality of it is that they're looking at us and saying we can leapfrog that, and I think Secretary Shane used those very words this morning, leapfrog.
I think you're wise to point out the competitiveness issues, and I had the opportunity to travel in my past job with then Administrator Mary Peters to China and saw some of those projects. Went to that new port outside of Shanghai and and then heard about some of the rail investments, and they are certainly doing a lot over there that will compete and bring a lot of competitive forces. I wanted to ask, each of you talked about the need for a national rail policy, different ideas for a national rail, either a trust fund or a financing system. Help me with filling in the details there. I remember, as a sort of student of the gas tax, because as a highway person, you're sort of used to living off of that at the state and federal level. There was, I guess, not too long ago, a 4-cent, 4.3 tax on diesel that applied to the rails. Didn't go to infrastructure, though, right? Just went to general fund.
Went to debt reduction.
General fund. That's correct.
And I guess over time, the debt, for a little while, the deficit was erased, and that tax went away, and now we've got challenges again. But is that a starting point, or what else could fill in the gap?
Let me, if I can, take an initial stab at that, and I'd ask my associate here, Mr. Jensen, to fill in the gaps. What we're proposing is that the infrastructure plan that needs to be developed, if developed singly railroad to railroad to railroad, kind of lacks the integration and network view. Our members use all the railroads, and they don't just live on their, and UPS is a classic example. They don't live on one railroad, they live on all of them. So the interdependency of the network and the system is critical. Now, this is going to take a kind of a mindset change on the part of a lot of people. And the idea being that there would be a national rail infrastructure plan that would be developed, obviously collaboratively with the railroads. You can't just do this and force it on them because they own the system. But if one railroad improves here and doesn't improve the interconnections, then what value is it for the system as a whole? As far as funding goes, we're not proposing any sort of trust fund that Tom had indicated might be advantageous. However, there's clearly the need for more capital to develop the infrastructure we need, and if this approach is something that makes sense, we'd certainly look at it with open eyes.
The only thing I'd add, Chairman Nottingham, to that is that just point of information, the 4.3 cents a gallon that the railroads had to pay went back to basically was just dismissed, while earlier on the trucking 4.3 cents a gallon, that was put back in the highway trust fund. So the money was just not, Commissioner Mully knows very well, the money was just not given back to the industry, but we put it back in the highway trust fund, which has got its own myriad of problems. As far as a trust fund is concerned, we use that phrase, but the term today, which is bandied about more, has been, of course, public-private partnerships and some entity, structure, mechanism where the government is involved. Yet I'm not suggesting full-scale regulation, and I recognize that there's folks who come here today and others walking around the hill talking about re-regulation, this and that. No, we're talking about is there a mechanism, is there a method to try to utilize some public money and or user fee money, we're not afraid to say that, and to direct it where it can help the most. Now, maybe that's a little more challenging on the rail network because of the private ownership than on the highway side, given the bottlenecks that we kind of are pretty easy to see in the national the interstate highway system. But that's where we are on that, and this has been talked about in previous Congresses, of course. It's been talked about in policy circles. It clearly needs some fleshing out, do not get me wrong, but we think it's time because given the capital, is my point, given the capital expenditures which they've done, which have been significant, and given this proposed ITC, which we're not opposed to, but we don't think does enough, we think more is needed.
Mr. Snovich?
Yes.
Do you have anything to add to the idea of having a national financing system for rail infrastructure and how that might work, or what some of the concerns might be?
Can't say anything to the financing system, but in a previous life, I was very involved in the National Network for Electric Utilities Transmission System, NERC, which coordinates the planning for the overall transmission system within the United States. And maybe something like that is also needed for the rail industry to ensure reliability and, you don't have bottlenecks and things such as that.
I would just add to that before yielding to the Vice Chairman. That one concern there is just the mechanics. I would be very interested, just as a consumer of transportation, as we all are, to know that there was some dedicated, thoughtful stream of funding that was going to support the already record-setting amount of investments that the private sector is contributing. I just would worry that it would get hijacked somehow into a 50-state plus territories, et cetera, and 435 congressional districts, and wouldn't really result in the kind of cost-benefit sort of analysis and impact on projects like CREATE and some of the other really high need critical ones that we would hope to see. And I guess to give anyone a chance to just address that, how you could make it work, and then I'll yield to the Vice Chairman.
I think it would take some magic to make that work. The reality of it is, it was mentioned by somebody earlier today, and with all the speakers, I've lost track of who it was. But the reality of it is that the transportation system in this country works fairly well, and the people who use it, the carriers and the shippers, are the most innovative and creative people I know. When an issue develops, they can't get it moved, they figure a way around it. Whether it's a labor issue on the West Coast ports, whether it's snow in the Powder River Basin, whether it's some sort of Katrina washout in the Gulf Coast, shippers and carriers figure out a way to get around it, and we get the job done. And we as consumers, you and I as consumers, can go to the store and expect the products to be where they are. And that's the beauty of the system. The challenge we face is simply this, that we don't respond in this country quickly enough to things unless it's a crisis. And when this becomes a crisis, you're talking about a 5 to 10 to 20 year time frame to fix it. And we have to get in front of the crisis.
Vice Chairman Buttry?
I have a question for Mr. Ficker. You would agree that you represent the largest shipper group in the
I like to think
the
so.
land.
Yeah, I like to think so. Thank
You would agree that you have considerable influence on Capitol Hill.
Again, I would like to think so.
Okay. Is it still your position that you have no position on the ITC?
Well, first of all, the bill was just introduced today, so I haven't read it. I don't know. I can't take a position on
That's not
something
the
I
answer
haven't
I was
seen.
looking for.
I didn't think it was.
It's puzzling to me that if both those first two statements are true, and given the fact that every single person that's been before us today has advocated the passage of the ITC, even Mr. Jensen in sort of limited fashion, everybody in limited fashion, so to speak, has advocated the enactment and the passage of the ITC legislation and the renewal of the short line railroad legislation. It's puzzling to me that the Bit League has not been more vociferous, if you will, in their approach, given the fact that it seems to me that you certainly support the idea that there needs to be every attempt that we can possibly think of to create more rail infrastructure for this country as quickly as we possibly can, because there's just not enough, there's not going to be enough revenue produced by the railroads to create the kind of infrastructure we need, despite the fact that they're making these exorbitant returns and so forth that we've heard all about today.
They're doing very well. If Warren Buffett thinks they're worth something,
For the record, that's tongue-in-cheek, by the way.
Yeah, right. Okay. If Warren Buffett thinks they're doing good, I'm there with him. He's my friend.
As the old saying goes, follow the money, right?
There you go. But in terms of our position on this, we have a process that we go through with our membership where we put the issue in front of our membership, debate it, argue about it, discuss it, and we haven't done that yet.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't do it last year because we knew, frankly, that bill was going nowhere because of the time it was introduced and the fact it was moving forward.
Maybe that's the reason it didn't go anywhere.
I think it was more than that. It never even got a hearing, I think, if I remember correctly, last year. So this year we'll do the same thing. We will go through the process and evaluate it. We have a rail committee meeting coming up in June that we fully intend to bring this discussion up to. And there is some debate inside the organization already as to the value of this. There are people who are concerned about where it's going to be spent and what assurances do you have. As an investment tax credit per se, there's no guarantee that an inch of track will be built. It's just the potential. That's just a reality of a credit. You have to spend it to get it. So I think what we want to do is understand how they would have proposed to do it and what would be the value for our members across the board. We are primarily representative carload shippers, merchandise shippers. A lot of those products are exempt from economic regulation by this agency, and they have a strong desire to make sure that their needs are met. Now, we've explained more than one time to our membership that improving the network should result in improvement for you individually wherever you are. But there's some skepticism on that from the past. So we're going to have a strong and vigorous debate, and then we'll take a position.
Mr. Jensen, I listened very carefully to your testimony, and I did not hear you say anything at all about intermodal pricing. I assume that was by design. You weren't here to complain about intermodal pricing. You were here to make the case for more infrastructure.
Mr. Vice Chairman, UPS will pay for service.
Glad to hear that.
If I can kind of address that, I think the issue of pricing is always one that gets people's attention, and somebody mentioned this earlier today. And I think what needs to be directed is it's about value, what you get for your transportation dollar. Mm-hmm. And I think that's kind of the point that Tom was making to some degree. You're paying for something and you're not getting what you used to get. And that concerns people. It's not a matter of not being willing to pay more. Most of our members deal with commodities of one form or another, is raw material, finished goods. And they understand supply and demand and how it works. But at least when you're in supply and demand, and we'll use gasoline as an example, when it hits $3 or $4 a gallon, the good news is you still get a gallon. The bad news is it costs $3 or $4. So I think it's about value, not about price.
Thank you.
Commissioner Mulvey?
Thank you. I thought we might pass on the Highway Trust Fund today, but the Rail Trust Fund today, but I guess it's come up. As you know, I've been a strong supporter of looking at this idea of a railroad trust fund. I worked with Congressman Lipinski a number of years ago to develop a proposal where we would have used the 4.3-cent deficit reduction fuel tax as a basis, but that was only $170 million, I believe, of the amounts that were in the proposal. It would have been $3 billion a year, roughly, depending upon how you calculated the taxes. And they're taxes. I believe in calling things what they are. The taxes. But the fact of the matter is, it's true, the railroads are very much opposed to the Railroad Trust Fund because they have a legitimate concern as to where the money would go, what control they would have over it, and what the quid pro quos would be. And I think more than anything else, they're concerned that they're a privately owned infrastructure and they want to continue to have control over that infrastructure. It's very, very difficult to take public money on the one hand and then continue to pursue, say, a bottleneck rate making on the other. And yet they consider the protection of the bottleneck rates critical to their ability to earn their cost of capital and to make profits. Now, so does anyone have any ideas as to how you could have a railroad trust fund on the one hand, using taxes from users, shippers, passengers, etc. on the one hand, and simultaneously make certain that it's not politicized and it does not threaten the railroad's ability to control their own destiny? John?
That's a challenging question, Commissioner, and I certainly wish I had the answer for you, and if I did, I would give it to you right now. I think the conflict between public money and private enterprise is really apparent in this discussion. My view is that as the concept of a tax credit would be out there, maybe it can be woven in with some sort of public thing. I think it was somebody from AASHTO today, or I can't remember who it was, talked about how you put priorities around where the benefits is and where the value is. I think it was maybe Chicago that was talking about that. You know, here's a project, how much is public, how much is private, how much is the railroads, how much is John Q. Public. Those things haven't been determined. And we all know what happened in the last reauthorization of the highway bill when you had 6,300 earmarks. out there. And I think the challenge that we face here would be to, if we create anything, how we can protect it, and those who paid into it could get it back. I think that would be the challenge, but the structure of that is well beyond my pay grade.
UPS has been in support of the trust fund. Do you have any ideas about how to address the railroad's concerns?
Well, Dr. Mulvey, I concur in that. You hit the nail on the head. How do you structure this thing without and protecting the railroads to the extent they should be protected? And in addition, not letting it get earmarked and hacked to death by, 435 or 535 friends that want a piece of that. If we could look at the network more from a network standpoint and less from a segment standpoint, and this route and that lane, to benefit the greater good and the network itself, as opposed to we're trying to take the parochial interest out of that. And I know that's a challenge, and that's something that we are, like Mr. Ficker, talking to folks in the industry that might be interested in trying to find some common ground that might be palatable to folks. It's challenging. There's no doubt about that.
The only other point I have, just an observation, you mentioned about shipping widgets from China, from Washington, D.C. to Beijing. I think the widgets come from Beijing to Washington, D.C.
Well,
I don't think we manufacture widgets anymore.
That's the typical flow, unfortunately, but we're working on balancing it out.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Just real quickly, Mr. Jensen, you heard earlier from the Department of Transportation, Secretary Shane, and others about the forecasting data. Obviously, UPS has got to be one of the more sophisticated forecasters of freight trends, and since you got to make huge plans and investments at different locations around the world, was that data acceptable to you? In other words, you think we can rely on it? Is your data dramatically different as far as what the forecast should be for freight flows coming in around the country?
No, it really isn't, Mr. Chairman. We look at this, and we look at all the public data, and we run a certain, needless to say, a bunch of economic analysis ourselves, and trying to forecast and plan out in 5 and 10 and 15-year increments. And we know where we are as it relates to the rest of the world. We see a big pinch point here, and the big pinch point is multimodal, which I alluded to earlier, and I think you would agree. And as a result, we're having the same dialogue and the same conversations with regulatory bodies and other policy-making bodies that deal with highways and deal with aviation. It's a real concern of ours, and I go back to what Mr. Ficker said. If they're half right, we're in a world of hurt. But that's why we need every mode to perhaps to buck up now. We're one of the few groups, again, we're not talking highways today, but we're willing to take a gas tax increase because that system is way broken. Well, we want to fix the rail system as well, or improve the rail system as well. So we're in line with what we hear from the DOT and AASHTO and TRB and other academics on this.
Thank you. And lastly, I'll just say as a point of just general information, some of you may already know this, we have a statutorily created Rail Shipper Transportation Advisory Committee that advises the STB and reports independently to Congress, and the board members only serve ex officio. We have no voting or influence over it. But good people, shippers, large and small, a couple of railroad members who don't vote, but they are there to contribute, and they took it upon themselves to write a letter to Congress recently strongly endorsing the investment tax credit. So I would just point that out. It's in.
Or those people are our board members.
Right. I figured they must be, and you can find information, I think, through our website, to the RStack, if that's of any help to anybody. I think that's all the questioning for this panel. Thank you so much for your patience today. We will dismiss you and welcome the next panel, 8.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Thomas Schick, Mr. Steve Hirsch, and Mr. Kendall Keith.